Hey, everybody. Welcome to chapter one of Spread the Word. I'm Nolan Brown. We have Kenny Scott on as well. We're going to discuss this, walk through it, and then we've got some questions at the end for your own discussion groups in your parish. Uh, Kenny, this chapter is titled The Great Commission. And if I had to boil the entire chapter down, it would be asking, what is the purpose of our parish? Like, why do we as Christians even exist as a church in the world? And what should our mission be? And I think he's saying the Great Commission itself is the mission, and that's really our focus. But did you have any other takeaway from that?
No, yeah, I think you're right. Like he is saying that like the church does exist to fulfill the commission that Christ gave us in Matthew 18, is that right? 16 or 18. But anyway, uh yeah, like that is the purpose of our church. And he does go to some great efforts, some strong words as far as what it looks like from the outside looking in. If someone was to look at some of our parishes, and if they were to kind of tell us what we were about, I think we might find that we don't look exactly like what the New Testament disciples and Christ would have thought as far as those representing the commission or his kingdom.
Totally. Yeah. I think Father Michael does a great job of not really pulling any punches. I mean, he says
Yeah.
what it is, and it's really eye-opening, I think, for us to take a look at, really the first thing he touches on is the busyness and the self-interest. And it's like, how much of our parish activities are really just focused on ourselves and, fundraising for a new project that we're doing, or building something, or, getting new furniture or new iconography or whatever. We have a lot of activity that seems to really be inwardly focused. And, he's making the point that that might seem a bit foreign to the New Testament church, because they weren't oriented around that sort of thing. They were living in a persecuted state where they really couldn't establish much, and their entire mission was to expand the kingdom on earth. So it's a really interesting question about how, why evangelize. It's really, I guess, not only that we're commanded to do so, but it's part of who we are. And I think he does a really good job of pulling that out of, the Great Commission really is our mission statement as a church, but we often get distracted by all these busy activities or these other
Right.
competing priorities that are a lot easier to grapple with because they're not drawing us out of our comfort zone, or they're not requiring us to engage beyond where we normally do. They get comfortable, I guess, those activities are more comfortable. But
Yeah, there was a part of there where he talks about like evangelism being like a way of spreading evangelism being compared to a fire spreads by burning, right? Like this is
yeah,
something that we like to continue going forward. We have to keep creating new converts and seeking after new people. I did like something that he said that we did reference the kind of as the New Testament church didn't have these problems,
mm,
and but now we do, and some of those things are just because of real life, right? I mean, yeah, the
mm,
New Testament church didn't have uh, capitalism and the certain the American life stuff. So
sure,
there are some things that obviously very different. But what he phrased it more, which was in a nice way. He said, somewhere along the way, somewhere along the road, they lost their way, right?
mm,
And so I think that's a lot of what our ministry is about. Is
mm,
not about doing any kind of new innovation, but saying like this is a way we used to be, and we've lost our path, and we're trying to get back on that path.
right,
But some of the things that we're doing that are kind of new and maybe unfamiliar to the
hmm,
disciples or that the New Testament period are valid, and
mm.
some of those things maybe need to be reconsidered.
Totally. Totally
Yeah.
agree with that. I mean, it's a natural byproduct of, I think, when we enter an era where we aren't as persecuted. I mean, we saw this when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. It had to deal with a very different set of issues than the persecuted church of the first couple of centuries there, because like, when you're no longer persecuted, there's the opportunity for other things to creep in, but there's also very practical realities that you have to navigate that are implicit in that. So that's a great point. Something else that Father Michael pulls forward here is this idea that we really need to know what the good news is. I
Right.
found that really interesting, and we could probably do an entire podcast episode or a series of them on unpacking, salvation and what is it that Christ has done for us. But I think in a very succinct way, I mean, he enumerated, I mean, first he began by the good news is that the kingdom of heaven has come. And I think that's very different than what a lot of people who may have encountered the Christian message, especially here in the West with a Protestant or even Roman Catholic perspective, is that it's more about justice. It's more about we were bad, God, Christ was good. He came and balanced the scales. And there's certainly a justice component to that. But
Sure.
I think that this idea of the kingdom of heaven coming to us, it's why we have domes and not steeples, right? It's like heaven is drawn near to us in the incarnation. And that is actually the good news is that Christ has then, how did he enumerate it? He died for us to enter our condition, not necessarily to balance the books. And then he's risen to conquer death and to overcome death so that we can enter new life and be set free from the dominion of death. And then he'll come again. These were the three things to then set everything in motion for eternity and put an end to the suffering. So what we have now between is this opportunity for repentance and the working out of our salvation. So it's the knowing what the good news is, I think, is essential for us as Orthodox Christians to actually know why we participate in the life of the church. Like, why is it that we have this faith? What's been your experience around that?
Well, so as you're talking, I was thinking about like there's probably going to be a lot of this going on as we go through this book.
Mm,
Just how much our understanding of evangelism and Christianity comes from our Protestant backgrounds,
totally.
and then how it's been changed as we become Orthodox and we've seen things in different lights.
Mm,
Because I was thinking about like what the good news is,
mhm.
and reading the book, it's very clear, and I would think as a Protestant we probably agree the same things, right? Like
Sure.
Christ died, he rose again, he's going to give you new life. Um, but I think that I think I'm pretty sure that I would have shared it in a very different way, right?
Mhm,
Like, or would have very different motivation. Like for me at that time as a Protestant, it would have been like, why are you sharing the gospel with people? And it's because I don't want them to die, right? I don't want them to go to hell, right? That
mhm,
was,
mhm,
the main impetus. I was talking with a group a few days ago, and we're kind of discussing um, what would be the one thing that you would want to tell someone else who's not Orthodox
mhm,
about your faith? Like,
mhm,
what would be the one thing that says like, this is why you should, or I would invite you to participate in the faith with me? And they had all kinds of reasons, right? Tons of reasons about like, their prayer life, their marriage, the things they're going through,
mhm,
healing, loneliness, community, all kinds of stuff.
mhm,
Um, but none of them, not one of them, were mentioning like, well, I don't want them to go to hell, or
mhm.
and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
not that like that isn't a real thing of our faith, right? That
Sure.
totally is.
Sure.
Um, but like the way that we as Orthodox evangelize and share the faith and the gospel starts from a place of like, isn't God amazing,
Mhm,
right? And I
mhm.
and I think that even as a Protestants, we say, of course, we believe God's amazing, but that wasn't really the impetus. That wasn't
Yeah.
the main thing was you got to you get your get out of hell card,
Your fire insurance.
and God's amazing, right?
Yeah.
But like our thing is very much like God is amazing,
Right.
and we want you to know Him.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I guess I was finding that fascinating reading the book of how
Mhm,
like it's how refreshing it is now to come across this approach um, that is like still very you know what you might call typically evangelistic or
mhm.
Protestant evangelism, right? But with this like focused on uh, uh, the amazing love of God rather than the
Mhm.
fear of God. And not that there
Yeah.
isn't a place for both, but like
Sure.
the emphasis is a bit different. And it's such also such a more pleasant way to share the faith.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like I don't have to scare someone into like, do you know that if you were to die tonight, where your soul would be? Right? I don't have to do any of that. Like that's not my
Totally.
thing, and that doesn't seem to be the way that Christ shared the
Mm,
gospel,
mm.
and it doesn't seem to be the way the disciples mimicked Christ in sharing the gospel.
Right. I think what you're saying there really resonates with me because it comes back to this idea of like Christ is the victor. Christ has conquered sin and death. Heaven has come. Like that's actually good news. The good news is that we were created good and therefore now we get to realize our potential because we've been set free from sin and death. And so it's like a positive perspective instead of a negative one. I mean, there's different types of discipline. What is it? Negative. when you apply something you don't enjoy as a consequence. I forget the
Oh,
name. There's a psychological term for it,
the
but
atomic habit kind of
negative
thing.
reinforcement
Yeah,
versus positive reinforcement maybe is what it is.
yeah,
And I feel like the 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 theology I grew up with was very negative reinforcement. If you don't X, then you will experience this bad outcome of hell or whatever it is,
yeah, right.
which actually puts you in a state of operating in somewhat of fear, a fear of, like you said, a fear of God's judgment rather than a embrace of the loving father towards the prodigal. There's a very big difference there. Um, but I think it for me, it's very important that we always maintain this heart of we are in a process of becoming what we were created to be, and that our fall into sin and death was not somehow destroying God's original plan, but was actually just part of the process of becoming. And his rescue enables us then to become more than we ever would have been had we not fallen.
Yeah,
Because
right.
there's a maturation that occurs. It's like it parallels so beautifully with, and not to wax too theological, but Saint Irenaeus talking about how Adam and Eve were like children in the garden. You know, they weren't these like fully functional adults who had knowledge of good and evil and could then like rebel against God and say, forget you and all this stuff. It was they were tricked actually by the deceiver. Like the evil one tricked them into doing something that actually was a noble cause. And we see that even with Abraham and Sarah. You know, like there's a promise of God, you will have a son. And then they try to figure it out their own way instead of being patient and waiting on God to do it the proper way. But God still manifests the promise through that broken experience.
Right.
And so there's just this undergirding hope and like an identity of goodness that I find in the Orthodox good news that makes it actually good news. Like
Right.
you're not
Nice to have
actually
good news.
it is really nice to have good news. But I think that we struggle oftentimes to articulate this because so much of the language has been, I don't want to say borrowed, but almost commandeered, right? It's like if I say the word salvation, there's all kinds of things that come to people's minds because of the message that's been so strongly put forward in our culture. It can be very difficult to get to a place of how can you articulate what the good news is. But I think it begins with us understanding it in and of ourselves and unpacking that. I mean, I know for me there's been this long journey of, getting rid of this guilt complex and getting a hold of this love complex, you could say, of it's not about my guiltiness or my goodness or my badness. It's about God's goodness and his love and my becoming and maturing in that, which is really powerful stuff. And I think is like central to our faith. Um, yeah. Well, I think then, this comes back into the book. He talks about we need to know what the good news is. Christ died for us. Christ is risen. Christ will come again. But then he brings it all back and says it's all about Christ and nothing else. And so then, he makes this really cool point of our goal with evangelism is not to, and there was a quote, I think it's on page 21, if I'm reading my notes correctly, that I thought was really powerful. And he says, we are mistaking catechesis for evangelism,
Mm.
preaching up front what should not be taught until people have actually decided to join and are being shepherded into the church. And I thought, wow, that really resonates because one of the major things in my heart is I just want the beauty and the joy of this faith to be known. Like
Yeah,
if people just knew it existed, they'd be on their way. But we're so cloistered and so hidden, the best kept secret, right? Kind of
right,
idea. It's like all we have to do is actually introduce them to the love of Christ within the fertile ground of the church where they can then grow and be catechized and come to that full realization. But we often focus on, good Lord, the doctrinal distinctions between the East and the West when it comes to original sin or whatever. It's like this real heady stuff.
sure.
And it's like I don't think that's actually what matters most at all. It's this introduction to Christ. It's those, what does he say? Evangelism is about helping people take those first steps toward a relationship with God. It's
Right.
about proclaiming that God is with us.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we do as evangelists, at least specifically in the Orthodox Church, because of, like you said, America's best kept secret, is that a lot of our job is just to create awareness, right? To
Mhm.
let other people know that we exist, to give
Yeah.
someone the opportunity to go through our doors and meet, see what our faith is like, and meet Christ in this fashion, because there's just so many people that just literally do not even know we exist.
Mhm.
So I think that's a little bit what he's speaking to. And then I think for myself, when I was reading that chapter, I was also kind of like, is that the right way? Is it the wrong way? What's too far? I mean, 'cause I think I understand, like, what you said about like these higher end things of doctrine, like that those, probably are not something that we want to be discussing with inquirers or seekers.
Mhm. Sure.
But then I also wonder, like, the I guess the state of where we find ourselves. Like,
Mhm.
is there a place to um, dialogue about theology as a form of evangelism? Like,
Sure.
I know right now that there's a lot of stuff on YouTube, and there's a lot of like what might be stereotypical kind of ortho bros kind of
Yeah, yeah.
stuff,
Right.
where I would think probably it's gone too far, and
Mhm.
they're really kind of um, talking about edge case stuff, not just kind of basic, what is the faith things. But then there is so much about what is different about the Orthodox faith. Um, that there is, like, I wonder if that's part of the sharing. And to be honest, I don't know. I'm kind of like genuinely asking, right?
Yeah.
Um, because I think about when I found out that Orthodox preached a God in Christ who like truly loved,
Mhm.
like, and I felt like I actually felt like this faith me, like when they say God loves me, like they
Mhm.
actually mean it.
Mhm.
And I always felt as a Protestant we would say it, but it was kind of all these little caveats, and like, he God loves you, but if Jesus wasn't there, he'd probably hate you, that kind of thing, right?
Sure. You get
And
that
and then here I'm
underlying
like,
sense. Yeah.
right, but part of our theology and part of like this wonderful message is that that's not true.
Right.
And so I do wonder about, where does that play? Because I think that there's some people that it is helpful,
Sure.
um, but then there's some, that like may vibe with all like the doctrine, and then their soul might not never ever be moved.
Yep.
So that seems to, and I think mainly as I'm talking about it out loud, like I think that the solution is that it's incarnational, right? Like whatever the situation is,
Yep.
it should be done in a way that's relational,
Yep.
right? So if I'm actually dialoguing with someone and I believe that other person to be a human being that God actually loves, then I
Mhm.
guess I can, avoid talking about theology and also talk about theology and know the right time to do it.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
makes sense?
Absolutely. Honestly, I think the fruit of Orthodox theology ultimately is peace. And in my own journey into the church, we have to meet people where they are. And if they're on the tip of that theological discussion and grinding on it, then coming to them in that place and being able to actually address the question, but do it in such a way that brings a sense of peace with it. When I would interact with my priest in my parish, the the questions I had were always handled very gently with a sense of, hey, you don't really need to worry about that. It's not like your eternal destination hangs on whether you understand this properly or not. But I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier. So much of what we've been taught in these, the Western perspectives on justice being supreme, is that there is this fear that if we don't get it right, we're going to be on the
Oh,
wrong side
totally.
of things. And so that drives a lot of the motivation for like digging in, understanding. It also appeals to our natural, I shouldn't say natural, our unnatural in our fallen state tendency towards wanting to be in the right. It's a very
Yeah.
tree of the knowledge of good and evil, very pharisaical, you could say, approach. But I agree with you. I think there is a need to not become intellectually lax, but to have good rigor and to have those conversations, but to always be turning them back towards a, I think of the Psalm, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," right? Like, beside still waters and green pastures, there's this peace of God that comes from knowing, no, you are good, you are loved, and you don't have to have it all figured out. That's the joy of the journey. There's
Yeah.
almost this race to arrive at the mountaintop instead of just enjoy the journey, that
Right.
that also comes through, but,
But
uh,
I think there is something too about removing barriers, right?
absolutely, absolutely.
Because I want someone to come and experience the church and experience the love of community and experience everything that we have to offer, and actually feel that inside their soul. But there
Yes.
are legitimate barriers, and living in our world and coming from an America that's dominated by Protestants and Catholics, and specifically Protestants in this example,
Mhm,
like Mary is a hard problem.
Hmm.
Right? It's a barrier. It's a barrier to entry,
Yep.
and there's actually like really good answers. There's actually really good, simple, not complicated, just ways to like to eliminate some barriers,
Mm.
so that someone might come into the parish and be more in a place to receive.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and so yeah, I mean, yeah, I understand like there's like a going too far,
Sure.
but then also there is a kind of just that thing of just removing some barriers to gently create a place of safety, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. We have to work through those things to arrive at that peace because this is something that's bothering me. Help me reconcile this. Totally.
right.
My wife came to actually to one of the first meetings we had with our priest, and she had a notebook of like 100 plus questions that she had, and
Yeah,
we made it through maybe the first four or five. And I think maybe that's what I'm trying to bring forward is when those questions start getting addressed, but the way that they're addressed is not in a okay, now you know the right thing about that. Let's move to the next thing.
yeah,
It's more
right.
of a, hey, all of these roads, all of these questions lead to the same place of my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Suddenly they become less, you get this sense of like, I don't have to have it all figured out. It's okay to be in progress, in process.
Yeah,
And I think ultimately that is the good news. Like we are all in process. We don't have to be perfect. God loves us and he's helping us become what we were intended to be. And he did that by incarnating, by conquering death, and by resurrecting. And we now get to participate in that journey through a community experience of worship and love of neighbor. It's just
right. You get to
so
enjoy the process.
I couldn't have done that better if I'd intended to write it down. It just came out perfectly right there. That's fun. Um, well, he then segues into, he says it's all about Christ. And then he goes into this idea of how did New Testament evangelism work? And I love the fact that he didn't say, well, first you do A and then you do B. It wasn't like, all right, you get a team of people. It wasn't practical in that sense. It was more talking about the elements or the principles that really bring it all together. And he mentioned five of them. And I think there's a common thread really through all five of these. The first one being a personal experience of God and that everyone needs to be converted to Christ. And I mean, I've heard this quoted before. There is no such thing as cradle and convert. I mean, those terms make sense and they're useful within a certain context to just understand your origin, your background. But when it comes to the faith, and I've personally been wrestling with this myself as a convert who has cradle children. How do I help them accept Christ for themselves? How do I connect them with a personal relationship with Christ? I
Yeah,
think that is, if we come on a Sunday morning and let's just say there's 50 people there, if three of them have a personal relationship with Christ and everybody else is like, I kind of don't want to be here, I kind of have to be, or they feel the pressure, the obligation, or whatever, then what's the ethos going to be of that parish? But if it's the inverse, then you've got a whole lot of people resonating in their core because of their personal experience, their personal connection with Christ. I think it breathes life into everything. So I mean, so that's what I took away from that first bullet. Did you want to comment on anything of that?
well, I guess I mean, yeah, like you're right that all 5 points did kind of overlap, um, but it seems to also almost in every way in each of the 5 points, he does like stress that like underneath it all, like the main thing of the church was evangelism, right? Like
Mm,
if you're spirit led, like the spirit's going to lead you to evangelism. The spirit's going to
mhm,
find ways for you to open up and share your faith with others.
mhm,
And then I think the first one was a personal experience of God,
mhm.
like that some people um, that are just focused on the inner workings of the church and maybe not the actual like mission of the church, like and to say like they said they occasionally receive the sacraments, but they are actually themselves not being converted, right? So
Mhm.
there's like in each of these points, there's like it's leading like the reason we do these things leads in a direction and it leads
Yeah,
to an outcome. And it's not just us coming to church on Sundays and receiving the sacraments, which is important, which we're supposed to do.
totally.
But like that's does not be seem to be the intent
Mm,
of Christ or his disciples and what we can understand from the Gospels
right.
or in the way that they approached evangelism. Like it was to share the faith with those around you, and then once doing that, going further.
Yeah, totally. Well, and it connects to me with this idea of when we forget why we're on this journey, things can become very mundane. I mean, it reminds me of my own marriage, even. Like if I forget why I am in love with this person, then I start to fall into this ritualistic, almost dead religion kind of interaction and modality where the things I'm doing are just rote and they're just routine. And then I realize like we aren't really connecting. We aren't really coming back to the center of things. And I think there's a inextricable connection between the two greatest commandments, to love God and to love our neighbor. It's like if we love God and we've received his love, that will ignite within us a love of neighbor that we can't help but do. And we can't help but want to connect with those around us and to be actually sharing the joy. It will just exude out of us. And there's an interestingly delicate balance here between, the idea that, well, you don't have to say anything, you just be and it'll all work. We love this phrase, come and see, but you can't come and see unless someone goes and tells. you,
Yeah.
you have to go and invite them. It's the Philip and Nathaniel, right? I found the Messiah. And then he says, come and see, because he doesn't have words to answer the question, because it's not about head knowledge, it's about experiential knowledge. But I think sometimes we fall back on this idea that, well, God will just make it happen, or the Holy Spirit's doing his work, and I'm just going to stay in my lane and do my little thing here. And it lets us off the hook of actually encountering the other
Right.
and actually loving the other. And I think the message of the gospel, the good news, is best articulated when it's just an overflow of our own joyful experience with God and neighbor in our community.
Right.
But it requires an intentionality of showing up in people's lives. I mean, we can't just cloister off and
Right.
not be
That
present.
that seems
So
like really
really
clear
interesting.
that the disciples and the early church using these five methods, they were specifically intentional, right? Like they
Yeah,
were taking
exactly.
action. Like it wasn't pray and wait versus come
Right.
and see.
Right. Yeah. Well, and even St. Paul's saying, I become all things to all people that I might save some. There's an intentionality there that's, it's like a speaker recognizing their audience. I'm not going to walk into a room and start talking about something completely irrelevant to the people I'm encountering. I have to consider who it is and
Right.
adapt to meet them where they are. There's an intentionality there, and it does require us to first and foremost care. But I think that that's where, if we don't have this personal experience of God, then we don't have the very thing that gives us the catalyst for loving the other, because it's required that we catch that love from God first, know that we are forgiven. I think he actually brings that up in one of maybe it's point 4, a profound sense of forgiveness. If I
Oh,
just run through these real quick, it's personal experience of God, trust in God, a spirit-led community, a profound sense of forgiveness, and then a focus on the essentials. I feel like all of these, the profound sense of forgiveness for me maybe touches most deeply on the thing that makes the most impact on whether or not a person is actually connecting with God and then able to love other, is it's knowing that you are forgiven, that you are loved, that you are good, and that there is hope. Um, I asked my wife, I said, in preparing for this chat, I asked my wife, I said, so how would you articulate the good news in simple words? And she goes, that there's hope and that I'm loved, that I'm good, and that there's more than the suffering and pain that I experience. Like this isn't the end, that there will be more than this. And I think that's it. It's that simple. But to me, it's that recognition that the spirit-led community, it's like if everyone in the community is actually tapping in to what is really important, what really matters most, that connection with God and that love of neighbor, then it will become an evangelistic community by simply the joy bursting forth from their lives
right.
and the desire to bring that to the world.
Yeah, and the ways that they were healed, like you said, forgiveness as
Totally.
well, but like also like healing, and like you said, like, those are things that your wife mentioned, right?
Mhm.
Those are the things that are probably each of those little phrases are probably attached to a story, right? Like they're actually
Exactly.
like, some an actual thing that she could tell somebody, right?
Yes.
And it reminds me of what Father Michael said when he was quoting Isaiah about when Christ came and he's in the synagogue, right? He says, "The Spirit of
Yes.
the Lord is upon me. Behold, He has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor." Right? Like,
Mm.
so do we know poor people? Um,
Sure.
he has sent me to heal the brokenhearted and to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind. Like, do we know people that are
Mm,
actually captive and also spiritually captive by their sins, and blind, brokenhearted, like the oppressed, right? Like, these are the people that Christ came to share the gospel with. And like, I'm sure that all of us can think of people when we hear this list and go like, yeah, there's people that I know that
mm,
are oppressed, right?
absolutely.
And this is apparently what Christ came for.
Right.
Why am I not telling them?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, and to
that's all
be
it is.
and to realize, I mean, to round this out, it's the last two major points of the book or the chapter are that believing churches are needed for people to join. Like the community itself has to have that as their central focus. This there is transformation occurring. There is forgiveness, there is healing. There are these stories that are coming forward and being written live in this community.
Yeah,
Otherwise, when people come, what is it that they're joining into? So there's that believing churches need to be there, and I think believing is coming back to those five essential components. But then it rounds it out with, the Great Commission is for everyone. It's not just for the clergy. It's not just for, the original apostles or the bishops. It's for all of us to be shining our light into the world. I mean, he's literally tells us, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden." Um, so it's
it
fascinating.
actually does remind me, going back to what we were talking about before
Yeah.
about um, evangelism, not catechism, and the difference,
Mm,
right? Because I could see someone coming to the faith, and I think
mhm,
I probably know people, you probably know people that have come, and it's because of truth claims, right?
mm,
Like, this is the true church. This is they have the right ecumenical councils and blah blah blah.
yeah.
Um, but their soul isn't touched, right?
Right.
So they don't have that deep sense of forgiveness. It's not about being healed. They didn't, because or they might say like, I joined the church because they agreed with everything I already thought. So there's no
Sure.
healing being involved. And so
Right.
if one is not being healed, then how can one actually be the member of the body of Christ, right?
That's right. That's right. Well, and one has to go through the pain and the suffering, but then also experience the healing and the joy of our salvation if there's going to be a light to shine. Like there is nothing to share. There's no beauty to even talk about if we
Yeah,
haven't ourselves began to enter into that and experience. I would say honestly, it begins with that seed of humility to acknowledge that we are in a position of needing to be saved. Like we
right,
actually need God's love and we need to become more than we are. And the willingness to put in the work to do that, I think is actually it's just directly connected with the willingness to show up in the lives of other people as well. So it's like those two things can't really even be separated because we are healed through, well, we become persons when we show up and are known by others as persons.
right.
And to me, that is, if you want to talk about an evangelism that's almost unspoken, it's that willingness to connect with those who are, and this is how Christ tells us, I think it's Matthew chapter 25, when he's separating the sheep from the goats. Many will say to me, Lord, Lord, and I will say, away from me, I never knew you. Both sides are clueless about what they did, but they showed up is the point, right? Or they didn't show up is the point. Um, and so I think there's this intentionality to bring the gospel, but the most powerful story is our own story.
Right.
And then it's laid upon the foundation of that catechesis, though, that allows us to make sure that those stories all come into a unified God story, you could say, that helps us all experience a perpetual and continual expansion into fullness. Um, and there's just such a beauty in that. So,
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
well, any closing thoughts before we dive into some of the questions for the parish group discussions?
No, I think it's been really good. I really enjoyed doing this. I think, but
Yeah,
yeah,
it's fun. Not bad for a first one. We'll see
yeah,
how
first shot.
future chapters go, but it's been a joy to chat through this with you, and we really hope that you and your local parishes have an opportunity to go through these questions. I'm going to read off each question, and then you can feel free to pause the video, discuss as a group, and then begin again. And you can do as many as you like. You can skip them if you don't want to answer it, however you want to proceed. So, our first question: how much of our parish life is focused on ourselves? The next question: If someone observed our parish, how would they write our mission statement? If they were to look at what we're doing, would a theme come out? Number three, are you able to tell someone the good news in simple words? Number four, why do people participate in our parish? Number five, how can our parish do a better job of helping everyone become converts to Christ? Number six, how does our parish provide a place people can experience transformation in Jesus Christ? Number seven, who belongs in our parish community? And maybe who doesn't? And finally, who can I hope to become by participating in the life of your parish? All right. Well, that does it for chapter one. Thank you all so much. I hope this was edifying for you. Look forward to seeing you in chapter two.